When you think of the band Soundgarden, you probably think of albums such as Bad Motorfinger or Super Unknown, but did you know they had two albums released before Bad Motorfinger that often get overlooked? Today we're going to discuss one of those albums, which is Louder Than Love, the second studio album by Soundgarden, released on September 5th, 1989. It's now celebrating its 35th anniversary. The album follows their debut, Ultra Mega OK, which came out in 1988. In my opinion, Louder Than Love is a significant improvement. I'll delve into some of the history of Soundgarden leading up to this album, including some problems with the bass player at the time, as well as some controversy with some of the lyrics. Then I'll discuss the positive and negative aspects, and together we'll determine if this still holds up 35 years later. I remember when this album came out in 1989. I actually bought it back then. I don't recall exactly how I discovered it, but I believe it was through MTV's Headbangers Ball. This was 2 years before the grunge movement exploded, so there wasn't really a category for this album. The word alternative wasn't even a buzzword at the time, and most of the popular metal bands were acts like Skid Row and Motley Crue. But this was very different. According to the band, they didn't want to be considered a metal album. They cited influences from bands like Bauhaus and Killing Joke, as well as Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, which is why this album is so unique. So let's dive into a little bit of this history of this band. In 1988, they released Ultra Mega OK on October 31st, less than a year before Louder Than Love. Ultra Mega OK did pretty well and put them on the map. They had a music video for the single Flower, which was in regular rotation on MTV's 120 Minutes. The big turning point for the band came when Flower earned a Grammy nomination for the Best Metal Performance in 1990, although that was a few years later. But at this point, they were gearing up to work on their first album with a major label, which would be Louder Than Love. However, they immediately started having problems with their bassist, Hiro Yamamoto. He wasn't pulling his weight, so they eventually released Louder Than Love, and critics compared them to both Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, but they were still very original. They also had issues with a few songs, such as Hands All Over and Big Dumb Sex, which led to the album receiving a parental advisory sticker, causing some stores to refuse to sell it. I'll get into that a little bit more later. This was their first album to chart on the Billboard 200, peaking at number 108 in 1990. But as I mentioned, they were having problems with Hiro Yamamoto, who eventually left the band to go back to school. The band then needed to find a replacement. They played a few rehearsals with Jim Tillman from a band called the U-Men, and later with Jason Everman, who had previously played with Nirvana. The band went on tour for a few months, opening for Voivod, who were supporting their album Nothing Face. However, after the Louder Than Love tour, they fired Jason Everman as they felt he just didn't fit the band. Eventually, they hired Ben Shepherd, who would record on the next album, Bad Motorfinger. I don't want to get into that right now. I have another video on that, and I'm going to link that one a little later. Now, let's talk about Louder Than Love. While most people agree that it's a good album, it isn't as strong as the two albums they released in the early 90s, which are Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown. Despite being a solid album, it does have some problems. I think the band was held back a bit due to issues with their bassist, Hiro Yamamoto, who was becoming increasingly disconnected from the group before he left. This might have held them back from having their Bad Motorfinger moment earlier, but we can't know for sure. So speaking of Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown, those albums definitely overshadow Louder Than Love. Some people might not even know Louder Than Love exists, especially if they're not die-hard fans. They might even think Bad Motorfinger is the band's debut. In addition, the band faced some backlash from early fans when they signed with a major label who felt they were selling out by moving from an indie label to a major one, but you know how fans can be. They're usually very difficult to please. Another reason this album didn't reach the heights of the other two albums I mentioned is likely the parental advisory sticker and the explicit lyrics of Big Dumb Sex, which could have held the band back further, given that the next two albums were a lot more mainstream. In terms of the songs, though, it's a solid album. There are a few tracks that are weaker. For example, Uncovered and Full On are more forgettable, and I've read some opinions that Full On has a poor arrangement and it's just a filler track. Before I get into the positives of this album, I think it's worth noting that this band was still finding themselves at this point. It wasn't until Bad Motorfinger that they truly discovered who they were and released two of the best albums of the 90s. So why is this album often overlooked? I think it's because, as I mentioned earlier, there was nothing that sounded like them back in 1989. The album features big guitar riffs and complex time signatures, and it was even before the grunge explosion of the early 1990s. The sound was very unique. It wasn't mainstream, it was heavy, it was dark, and the songwriting was very complex. Then there's Chris Cornell, who had one of the best voices out of all of the grunge bands. I think he's one of the reasons Soundgarden eventually reached the heights that they did. Another aspect I should have mentioned earlier was the production. The album was produced by Terry Date, who did a great job of capturing the band's raw energy. The songwriting is also notable for its complexity with unique rhythms on songs like Hands All Over. Then there's Gun, which has a slowing down and speeding up rhythm that makes it stand out. Ugly Truth is a great song with a hard rock style and epic vocals from Chris Cornell. Power Trip is often said to have a Led Zeppelin influence and one of the more emotional tracks in the album. Loud Love is a fantastic song with heavy guitars and lots of tempo changes. There are also darker songs like I Awake and No Wrong No Right. The band also had a really great guitarist in Kim Thayil, who had a unique style and was able to write interesting guitar riffs. So is this an influential album? I would say so. Let's look at the facts. According to Kirk Hammett, the album inspired him to write the opening guitar riff for Enter Sandman. So that alone might be enough to justify it being their most influential album. Without Louder Than Love, perhaps the Black Album would have never existed. That's just speculation, of course. But Big Dumb Sex was also covered by Guns N' Roses on their 1993 album, The Spaghetti Incident, as part of a medley, and Guns N' Roses were one of the biggest bands at that time. That's another point in their favor. In addition, the cover artwork was used as inspiration for the 2020 single Deep Set by Greg Puciato, who's the vocalist of the Dillinger Escape Plan. So I think these factors make a strong case for Louder Than Love being a very influential album. So in conclusion, I think it's a great album, one of those albums that predates the grunge explosion, but it's hard to categorize. Even grunge itself is difficult to define, as most bands sounded different. You had Nirvana, who sounded more like a punk rock band. Pearl Jam had that classic rock vibe. Alice in Chains had a dark and gloomy sound. And then Soundgarden had big, loud vocals and complex arrangements. They were all different. And you could also consider lesser-known grunge bands like Melvins, who were more like sludge metal, Mother Love Bone, who were completely different. Then there were bands considered grunge, but not from the Seattle scene, like Smashing Pumpkins and Stone Temple Pilots, who had their own unique sounds, but still fell under this big umbrella of alternative or grunge. I think Louder Than Love was a big influence on most of the bands I just mentioned, to some degree. Maybe not Nirvana, since they already had an album out, but it's still an early addition to the grunge albums, and I think everyone should check it out. So if you only know Soundgarden from their big two albums, this one is worth a listen. As for ranking Soundgarden albums, this would be in the top 5. So that's all for now. If you're interested, check out this video I did on Bad Motorfinger when it celebrated its anniversary. I believe it was 3 years ago. And check it out. Thanks for watching. Please like this video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe. If you have not already, I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.